Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Lopez, Communications Coordinator here at United Ag, and welcome to our last health chat session of the year. And again, with us, we have Dr. Rosemary Koo, who will share her insights on endocrine disruptors and hormone health.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank our sponsors, Cyan, Blue Shield California, and Elite Medical. And today we're going to be talking about endocrine disruptors and hormonal health. I'm going to be using the acronym EDCs throughout the talk to refer to endocrine disruptors, and EDC just stands for endocrine disrupting chemicals, and it's used basically synonymously with endocrine disruptors. Now, our hormones in our body regulate almost every system, including growth, metabolism, reproduction, stress, our immune system, and even brain health. But they can actually be thrown off balance by chemicals and environment, known as the EDCs or endocrine disruptors. So today we're going to be talking about what EDCs are, their health impacts, the sources of EDCs, how to reduce exposure, and then we'll also talk about United Ag resources and Q&A at the end. So first off, what are EDCs? And before I go into what they are, I'm going to quickly talk about how hormones work. So our hormones are essentially chemical messengers in the body that allow different organs that can be far apart to communicate with one another. So the hormones travel throughout the bloodstream and then they bind to specific receptors on cells, kind of like fitting a key into a lock. And if the key matches, then the hormone is able to tell the cell what to do. But the EDCs can actually disrupt this communication in a number of ways. The EDC chemicals can actually mimic the hormone itself, so it makes it seem like you have higher levels of the hormone in your body than you actually do. Some of them can also block the hormone from functioning, and they can also increase or decrease the active level of hormones. They can either bind them specifically, which makes them inactive, or they can actually affect how the hormones are broken down. And then lastly, they can also affect how the hormone genes are expressed as well. Now, most EDCs are artificial chemicals, but some can actually be natural. And they can actually impact our health at even very low doses. And then, unfortunately, they are widespread through our environment. It's nearly impossible to avoid them altogether. And they enter our body in a number of different ways. We ingest them through food and beverages. We can also breathe them in. Some can actually be absorbed through our skin. And then they can also be absorbed through the placenta or breast milk to impact growing fetuses and young babies. So first off, what can they do to our body? So a lot of endocrine disruptors are kind of talked about in the context of women's health and estrogens. They can actually have a much broader impact on health than just reproductive health. But regarding reproductive health for women specifically, EDCs can affect ovulation, lead to endometriosis, fibrosis, and even PCOS. And the men are equally effective. There's been a lot of studies shown that EDCs can decrease testosterone levels and also impede sperm count and motility. And as a result of these effects on fertility, there's been studies show that there's actually a 20% likelihood of conception when there's high EDC exposure amongst heterosexual partners. So the impact of EDCs is not insignificant, especially when it comes to fertility and reproductive health. But EDCs can also lead to increased risk of cancer, specifically breast cancer, prostate, testicular, kidney, thyroid, and also endometrial cancers. And they can also impact your thyroid health by impacting your balance of the thyroid hormones. And there's also been lots of studies that show that EDCs can impact metabolic health, so leading to things like obesity, insulin resistance, and even diabetes. Interestingly, there was one study that showed that 13% of diabetes could actually be attributed to EDCs. So that's pretty crazy that 13% of cases might actually have nothing to do with diet or exercise, but actually more related to the chemical environment. And in addition, based on what we know about EDCs and how they can affect your immune system and also pancreatic function, these chemicals can actually potentially lead to type 1 diabetes. So it's not just type 2 diabetes, it's actually both types of diabetes could be impacted by EDCs. The severity of the impact of these endocrine disruptors is really more determined by timing rather than dose. So, even small doses can impact health, especially for developing fetuses, children, and adolescents. During these early life stages, these are times of very rapid growth. Your hormones are very active during this time to make sure that you develop properly. And also, there's a higher ratio of exposure um, to the body weight. So all of those factors lead into this population being especially susceptible, and it can impact the neurodevelopment of the young children. It can trigger early puberty. It can minimize vaccine responses and even impact mental health by increased risk of things like anxiety, depression, even later on in life if there was early high exposure to EDCs. So, if you are pregnant or even planning for pregnancy, if you have children in your household, you do want to pay attention to make sure that your exposure to EDCs is as low as possible. You're never going to be perfect. There's throughout our environment, so you can't be 100%, but here are some things that you're going to want to be aware of. One of the largest sources of EDCs in our environment is from plastics. And the two major EDCs in plastics to be aware of are bisphenols and phthalates. BPA, bisphenol A, is actually probably the most well-known EDC out there. And it's most commonly thought of as an estrogen-like EDC. So there's been mostly studied in terms of women's reproductive health, but it can also have a lot of metabolic consequences as well. Phthalates are kind of like the opposite. They are thought of as the anti-androgen EDC. So they've been studied mostly in male fertility and can act against testosterone and impact kind of sperm and motility. But again, it can also impact metabolic conditions like obesity and insulin resistance as well. Now, plastics are everywhere in the environment, but the easiest way to determine if a plastic is safe or harmful is to look at the recycling number. So, the number in that little triangle that's on the bottom of plastics. So, number three, polyvinyl chloride or PVC, is one of the higher risk plastics. And number seven, polycarbonate, is also higher risk. Now, number seven is also the same number to indicate other plastics. So it's polycarbonate and other. So if you see the other is listed under the number seven, it actually might be a safe plastic. But if it's a polycarbonate plastic, it is a higher risk for containing EDCs. And number six, which is polystyrene, is moderate risk. So you'll want to avoid that as well. That's mostly in like those disposable cups and some takeout food containers, and also occasionally egg cartons. Now, the rest of the plastics, one, two, four, and five, are much lower risk than three, seven, and six here. And aside from your plastic food and beverage containers, you're also going to be aware of food can linings. So here is a little bit tricky. It's like you'll see canned food labeled with P that they say that they're PBA free, and that's good. If your choice is between one that doesn't say that and says PBA free, you want to go for the PBA free one. However, there are bisphenol substitutes that the manufacturers are using in canned food linings that may have endocrine disrupting activity. And so that might be considered BPA free, but it can also potentially have a health effect. So you'll want to try to avoid canned food if you can, or minimize them as much as possible. Processed foods, especially the ultra processed foods, tend to have a higher level of EDCs, and that's because of the manufacturing process. Like if you think about it, things like chips or like sausages, deli meat. They go through a whole lot of processing. There's a lot of plastic tubing in there, conveyor belts, glove handling. A lot of that can potentially add EDCs into the food. Also, fast food packaging tends to have a higher risk of containing endocrine disruptors, especially the grease-proof papers that fast food is often wrapped in. Here's an interesting one is thermal receipt paper has a high level of PBA for some types of the thermal receipt paper. And thermal receipt paper is usually like most of the receipts that you get in the store is actually printed on thermal receipt paper, and it's paper that is chemically modified so that when heat hits it, then it's kind of printed out. So it doesn't rely on ink, but it's more of the chemical process that causes the printing. You'll want to handle that as little as possible, or just request a digital receipt itself because the PBA from that thermal receipt paper can actually be absorbed through your skin. So don't touch it or handle it as little as possible. Vinyl can also contain endocrine disruptors, and you might not think of something like your shower curtain as potentially impacting your health, but if you have a vinyl shower curtain, some of those endocrine disruptors can actually leach out from that vinyl and either enter the air or fall on things in your environment like the dust or your toothbrush and then get into your body that way. So if you have a vinyl shower curtain or vinyl flooring, you'll want to consider replacing that when you can. And also, you want to be aware of plastic toys and baby bottles. Over the years, there's been growing sensitivity around BPA and EDCs in children's toys and also baby bottles and kind of those sippy bottles. So most of the products today have a much lower level of endocrine disruptors than they did before, but you want to, check the labels and make sure. Um, Now, heating the foods in these plastic containers or storing fatty or acidic foods can make leaching worse. So you want to make sure you don't want to microwave any of your food in the plastic containers itself. I know it's inconvenient, but try transferring it to a plate instead. But the safest materials for food storage are glass, stainless steel, silicone, or even ceramic, but you want to make sure the ceramic is lead-free. And then avoid the canned products, ultra processed, and fast foods. Secondly, pesticides and herbicides are another source of EDCs in our environment. Here are just a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but the thing to remember here is both commercial and household products that are pesticides and herbicides can contain endocrine disruptors. And if livestock is near soil or water that has had contact with these chemicals, they can actually settle into the fat of the animals, and then we can consume them if we choose fattier cuts of meat. So you want to be aware of that, like depending on the kind of, if you want to know where your meat comes from, and if there's any question there, you want to choose leaner cuts of meat to avoid that. As far as produce goes, in order to reduce your exposure here, you want to wash your produce in baking soda. So super cheap, non-toxic. And baking soda is actually very effective at breaking down pesticides. If you're not able to wash them very well, you can peel them. Or for certain foods that are difficult to wash or might be high residue, you'll want to consider organic for those. And I know there's some controversy here over, how much organic is better. But over time, we will gather more data and evidence around kind of making sure which chemicals are safer in production. If you have a home garden, you'll want to avoid using chemical pesticides and herbicides at all possible. And so put in an integrated pest management strategy, which is, kind of your system for prevention, monitoring your pests, using kind of biological control mechanisms like putting in predators into your garden that will eat the pest, that kind of stuff, so that using the chemicals is kind of the last resort. And then for you folks that might use pesticides and herbicides in your work, you'll want to strictly adhere to your PPE guidelines. So your personal protective equipment is super important here, not just for your own health, but also to make sure you don't bring any of those chemicals back home, especially if you have small children. And I just noticed we'll do Q&A at the end, but I will just address Marco's question really quickly here is that there will be the PowerPoint and the whole presentation will be online later. So don't worry, you don't have to memorize anything. You don't need to frantically take notes here. All right. So on to industrial chemicals. So activities such as manufacturing, chemical processing, et cetera, can lead to industrial chemicals being present in our household products and also in the environments where we live. And one of the worst for potentially impacting our endocrine system are forever chemicals. So PFAS is kind of the class of forever chemicals, and there are a lot of kind of other more specific chemicals that go under it. But if you see PFAS free, that should really cover you from forever chemicals. And these are chemicals that have been used in the manufacturing of things like older non-stick cookware, waterproof and stain resistant carpets, fabrics like that, fast food packaging. They can also leach into your drinking water supply, and they can also impact your meat and fish supplies, especially if somehow the water system got contaminated where the fish and livestock have been. Now, more modern cookware, even if it has kind of like a Teflon coating, should be free of forever chemicals. It's not always 100%, especially if the coating has been scratched. But the government has tried to limit these in kind of the newer production items. But if you have an older vintage nonstick cookware, you might want to consider replacing that, especially if it's been scratched. Now, PCBs are present in some older electrical equipment or caulking and paint. Dioxins and furans and heavy metals can also enter in our environment from chemical manufacturing, burning waste, mining. And interestingly, actually, dioxins and furans can even come from volcanoes and forest fires. So, natural and kind of synthetic processes can cause these industrial chemicals to enter in our environment. And so the best things that you can do here is be kind of choosy about your cookware. Make sure if it is scratched to replace it, or choose some of these non-toxic options such as ceramic, cast iron, or stainless or carbon steel. You'll want to also filter your drinking water using either activated carbon or reverse osmosis. And when you can, please choose low mercury fish or brands of fish that are known to actually test for mercury levels in each of the fish. So that will help you reduce your mercury consumption here. Next is consumer and personal care products. So, for most people, this is one of the highest sources of endocrine disruptors that can enter your body. Um, so, you want to be careful of chemical UV filters. Oxybenzone and octinoxate can disrupt your endocrine system, and they're one of the more common chemical UV filters. Parabens are synthetic preservatives that are in a lot of products. They can be in your lotion, your shampoo, conditioner, moisturizers. They prevent mold and bacteria growth, which sounds great, but they are well-known EDCs. Phthalates, I talked about in plastics earlier. They're actually also in your personal care products in the form of synthetic fragrances. Triclosan is an antibacterial agent that is not as much used today, but can be in some legacy cleaning and personal care products like soap and toothpaste. So you want to check for that as well. But the products here that are kind of most likely to contain EDCs are sunscreens, your makeup, cosmetics, shampoo, conditioner, moisturizer, soap, and nail polish. Nail polish does have a lot of chemicals in there that can impact your hormones. So you'll want to make sure it's at least 3 free or as high number free as there is possible. I'm not sure what kind of the maximum there is these days, but like I've seen like 10 free, 13 free. but you want to make sure your nail polish is non-toxic. And be sure to check your labels. Parabens and phthalates are usually marked. Perfume and fragrance that's synthetic is also phthalates. So check for that as well. Um, and I know this might be disappointing to see this whole list because you're probably thinking, all of my stuff has this. But the choices that you can make that might be healthier would be mineral sunscreens, so zinc oxide or titanium oxide, and look for fragrance-free products instead. Some products are labeled unscented, and that's not the same as fragrance free. Unscented might mean that there are masking fragrances in there. So you want to look for specifically fragrance free. If you do want to use fragrance like perfume, the safest way is actually to put it on your clothes so it's not touching your skin, so your outer layer of clothes. And products that are scented with essential oils, so completely natural fragrances, are generally safer than the synthetic fragrances. So you can look for that as well. Just of note there, as far as the essential oils, lavender and tea tree do potentially have some mild effects there, but for general adults, it's perfectly safe. Just make sure the product is properly diluted with the essential oils. Now, it might surprise you, but most people, the highest EDC exposure is actually indoors and not outdoors. And dust is the major kind of vehicle for EDCs indoors. And basically, dust contains all the endocrine disruptors from the plastics, electronics, cleaners, textiles. It all kind of collects in dust. And especially if you have children on the floor, they're really close to that dust and can ingest it that way. So you want to make sure that you use a HEPA filter vacuum and also wet dust or wet mop afterwards. Because sometimes if you just vacuum, there can still be a fine layer of dust that's still there. And you don't want to just push it around. You actually want to get rid of it. So you might need to go through with like a wet rag or also do wet mopping instead on top of that. Um, HEPA air filters can also help to a certain extent, and you want to be careful about your cleaning products. So, after this, go home tonight, look at your things like your laundry detergent, dish soap, broom sprays, cleaning sprays, etc. And see what's on there. What kind of synthetic chemicals are there. And you want to make sure that you're choosing products that are fragrance free or only scented with essential oils. Laundry and like things like fabric softener, those like dryer sheets, and laundry detergent that's kind of that marks themselves as like long lasting scents. Those are typically made with synthetic fragrances, and that could be a major source of EDCs in your environment. So take a look at the products that you're using. And again, I've mentioned, you want to replace that vinyl flooring or shower curtain, and even your mattress cover could be made of PVC. So take a look at kind of the materials that are closest to you in your house. So throughout this conversation, I've mentioned a lot of ways to reduce your exposure, and I know it can be really overwhelming and hard to keep track of. But for most people, there are 5 things you can do that can make the biggest impact. And those are these 5. Is first is to replace your plastic food containers and avoid heating food in plastic. Second is if you minimize your ultra processed food and fast foods, that'll go a long way. There's a lot of endocrine disruptors in that process and also in those fast food wrappers. Third is to filter your drinking water. So either using an activated carbon filter or reverse osmosis. Fourth is to choose fragrance-free personal care and home products. And then fifth is to reduce your household dust by HEPA vacuuming and then wet mopping or dusting. So I know it can be, really scary to think about all the changes you might have to make, but these 5 small changes would make the most difference for most people. And then lastly, for United Ag Resources, if you're worried about any of the health effects that you might be experiencing and want to talk more with a clinician about, changing things or how you can improve your lifestyle to maximize your health, um, we have several resources for you. First and foremost is always our health and wellness clinics. They're excellent for primary care. They're also really good for chronic condition management. So if you have something like hypertension or diabetes, they'll help you along the way. And also, they have free one-to-one lifestyle coaching. So if you need someone to help you with nutrition or to put in a stress management strategy, they will help you there. And then, of course, we also have Teladoc for on-demand needs as well. All right, so I covered a lot of ground today, and then we'll pause here for questions. If there are no questions, I'll actually throw it back to Jessica for the moment to see if there are any announcements you'd like to provide.
Yeah, first of all, Rosemary, thank you. That was so educational. I like reading into these topics, and most of these things I hadn't heard of. So thank you. Um, and this is the last health chats of the year, but we have new episodes in the works for 2026, so stay tuned for announcements on that coming soon. And then this is Rosemary's last health chats with us. So, Rosemary, thank you so much for all your time and
Oh.
dedication in putting all this research into our health chats. It's been incredible hearing them and watching them over the last few years. So, thank you.
Oh, thanks so much for that. And thank you for helping me along the way and all the rest of the communications team for really working behind the scenes to make this such a successful program.
Yeah. We do have one question from Marcos. He asks, how about the use of dishwashers?
Oh, that's a great question. And there's a lot of factors regarding dishwashers. So, first of all, if you want to look at your dishwasher detergent, again, make sure it's fragrance free. A lot of the more kind of like eco-friendly choices are generally better. It's not 100% because sometimes it can be kind of false marketing. But again, look at the ingredients. Fragrance free or scented with just essential oils are safer. Another factor about dishwashers is they tend to use high heat. So if you're putting your plastic containers in your dishwasher, even the ones that are marketed as dishwasher safe, over time that can actually cause some of the endocrine disrupting chemicals to leach out more. So if you are going to use plastic containers for food storage, which I totally understand, they're light, they're cheap, they're really convenient. Um, just try to make sure they're not number three or number seven polycarbonate. And then also try to avoid putting them in the dishwasher and avoid heating them in the microwave. So yeah, that's a great question about the dishwashers. Thank you, Marcos. Any other questions?
If I may, add a comment.
Mm.
There was a couple apps that I downloaded just because this is so overwhelming. There's so many things to know, and I don't know. I'm not a professional. I don't know. But there's one app called Yuka, Yuka, that you can scan a barcode. It tells you about the ingredients and how safe they are. If there's anything that red you can avoid. Um, and then it also gives suggestions as to healthier options. And the second would be Ingrid, Ingred. And that scans a list of ingredients and also tells you if there was anyone that is like labeled red to avoid. And those have been helpful because again, I there's many ingredients that are out there and we don't know, if they're good or bad. So just a helpful tip.
Thank you. Those are great recommendations. I don't personally use those, but I can see how they can be really helpful. So thank you, Jessica, for mentioning that.
Yeah.
All right. If there are no more questions, we'll end it here. So thank you so much for joining me today. and for all of the other health chats in our series. And I hope you have a great holiday season.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.